world. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is Doug Brunke, founder and CEO of Global Chamber, and we are really honored and pleased today to have two consummate experts around a very important topic, USMCA and what is NAFTA today. There's lots of changes, there's lots going on, there's politics, there's exporting, there's importing, there's drama, there's men, there's women, there's all sorts of things going on right now. We're going to sort through that for you so that you as a business person can figure out at least what the possibilities are, and I think Dan's going to cover some of the different options where this may end up laying out, and then what you need to do as a business owner. So our first speaker will be Dan Ujczo. Dan is the practice group chair in international and regional practice at Dickinson Wright. He is the preeminent expert on USMCA and NAFTA. If you ever read any of his documents, it's so detailed and so right on the money. We've been watching him work for the last year or two in terms of following what's going on, and he's always right there. So put your money on Dan. Dan, thank you for sharing your expertise today. We aren't going to put any money on you, but we are going to count on you for some information that undoubtedly will be very valuable.
Well, great. Then thank you, Doug, for the opportunity once again to partner with the Global Chamber. It's a privilege again to be here with you and with David, who we'll be hearing from in about 20-25 minutes or so. I'll check with our gaming group, our gaming and sports entertainment group. I don't think anybody wants to put any money on these predictions because everything's kind of changing at the speed of the tweet. But once again, that the Global Chamber is hosting one of these webinars. You may be where the money needs to be because we're at a very important date. I chuckled at first when we said October 8th. The question would be, would this be done or not? I think we all were of the view that we would still be in this process. But October 7th, yesterday, was actually the 27th anniversary of the original NAFTA being signed in San Antonio. And so we're a day later than that. And of course, today we have a congressional delegation down in Mexico talking about labor reform in Mexico's budget. And we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But this is it. This is, I think, the general consensus, both from the supporters from the USMCA, but also on folks like the Replace NAFTA Coalition and others that tend to be more progressive leaning, have all recognized that the time is now. Where we are, and so it's just a credit to the Global Chamber once again for keeping the membership up to date. Now, in terms of our role at Dickinson Wright, we've been part of this coalition or part of the work with the Global Chamber for a number of years now. And been talking about these issues. I'm just having a little bit of a problem advancing the slide. I don't know if there's something else I need to be hitting here. But if we could go to the next slide. Dickinson Wright, just the perspectives from where we're coming. You can see we have about 20-odd offices located throughout the United States and Canada. Our headquarters, our mothership is in Detroit. We actually started doing a lot of agricultural work and continue to do so from this day. So one of the perspectives that we come to this with is what's the perspective of our farmers, our growers, our producers, and then processors and retailers. And then, of course, being originally from Detroit, our earliest clients were the Dodge brothers. So automotive, advanced manufacturing, just so critical to the North American supply chain. And you can see we have a heavy concentration of our offices in the Detroit, southeast of that state, north of Ohio, where I'm based, down Automation Innovation Alley to Nashville, where there's a great Global Chamber led by Amos Smith and the gang there, and then down through that southeastern quadrant to Florida. And so we really pick up that perspective of what's happening in the manufacturing side of things. But so much of our R&D and innovation work happens on the shop floor. And from starting there, we now have offices not only in Innovation Alley, but also in Silicon Valley and Austin, Texas, and Columbus, Ohio, which are these tech capital, tech centers of the United States. And so what's happening on the digital front. And so from that perspective, we come together. Now, we've been doing Canada-U.S. since the 1860s, 1870s. Our offices in Canada actually date back, they're actually a little bit older than our U.S. offices. And then we've been down working with our clients in Mexico since the 1960s and 1970s. And so we try to bring that North American perspective because, you know, what we see here in, say, the Great Lakes region, I never use the phrase Rust Belt. I consider that phrase an insult. But what we see here in the industrial Midwest, our perspectives on North American trade are a little bit different than our friends, say, in Arizona. In our offices in Phoenix and elsewhere, I can tell you one of the most active delegations on USMCA has been in Arizona with not only the congressional delegation, but Governor Ducey and David has been instrumental in part of that. But the perspectives there are even a little bit different than what we see in Florida, particularly when we get into issues like seasonal produce. And so one of the ways that I think we've been able to bring this all together is that we have these different geographic locations and subject matter areas to bring that all to a head. If I can go to the next slide, please. Just very quickly, while we've been around forever and a day, we're still one of the fastest growing law firms. We're in the top 5 fastest growing law firms in North America. We have a 100% score on corporate equality, so our diversity and inclusion programs. And then, of course, we're ISO certified for cybersecurity and elsewhere, which we encourage all of our clients to be ISO certified, and we ourselves are as well. Moving to the next slide. So where are we right now when it comes to USMCA, and moving to the next slide as well, that the issues that we're looking at. So USMCA is just part of a larger pillars of trade in 2019. Of course, USMCA is the front lines of what was happening. That's what the president ran on back in 2015 going into 2016. But keep in mind, all of these issues are interrelated as a company. A big part of USMCA was China. Part of the U.S. approach, the overarching philosophy was shutting the back door to North America via Canada and Mexico for China. Because while the U.S. has trade agreements with 20 trading partners around the world, we've largely been stuck in neutral on trade for most of the last couple of decades. Meanwhile, Canada negotiated upwards of 50 trade agreements. Mexico had nearly 60. And so what we were seeing in the era of globalization is that more and more product was coming from China in particular into places like Mexico and the U.S. So the idea was if we were going to take China head on, that we had to close our back doors here. And we see some of that in this agreement. And that's often lost in the discussion that USMCA is also a front line for us on China, of course, rebalancing trade with Mexico. And the issue there that often gets lost, there's no objection. I can't speak for the Trump administration, but if you look at the overall strategy, there's no objection necessarily to low-skill, low-cost production being done in Mexico and Asia and elsewhere. The idea is, to be blunt, Mexico got too good at attracting investment from the United States. And so we saw Mexico competing for higher-skilled, high-end manufacturing jobs, and those plants were leaving the industrial Midwest and elsewhere to go to Mexico. And that, of course, has been the U.S. position is, well, that's fine. If you want to compete, you have to do so with equal footing on labor and wages, et cetera. And so rebalancing trade with Mexico. And then the grand bargain was, in order to do that, to take on China and rebalancing trade with Mexico and the USMCA, that the business community would obtain some benefits on digital trade, customs and trade facilitation, and a 21st century trade agreement. And that's really the balance that the U.S. is, at least the White House is trying to strike throughout its trade deals. So USMCA really is the front lines. Of course, all of this came at the same time where we were dealing with Section 232, national security tariffs on steel and aluminum. And those tariffs are largely still in place with the exception of a handful of countries, chief among them now, Canada and Mexico, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But for companies that are facing that deal with steel and aluminum, importing from around the world right now into North America is still a significant challenge, because one of the ways that Mexico and Canada were able to get those steel and aluminum tariffs lifted off of themselves is to agree to a monitoring system. And so Mexico had been closed to steel from anywhere that Mexico didn't have a free trade agreement through September. That's been continued into this month. And Canada has taken very aggressive postures on steel and aluminum as well. So right now, getting foreign steel into North America is very challenging. The Section 301 tariffs, again, the timeliness of this Globinar is critical because, of course, China's coming to town this week. And so right now we have at least 25% tariffs on 250 billion of China-sourced goods. And there's now been what's called List 4, and now we may see next week that 25% go up to 30%. And China's been subject to different Globinars, and we're, of course, dealing with that. And then lingering behind the surface is the president needs to make decisions on automotive on Section 232 by November of this year. The likelihood is that the president may punt, but good news for North America is that in the discussions of USMCA, there has been a pledge and an agreement, a side letters, that Canada and Mexico will not be subject to that production on current levels, and then some room to grow on. So that should be good news for North America. And of course, the U.S., beyond those trade enforcement side, we just did a mini deal with Japan, signed earlier this week, and a deal with the EU, which will not probably happen in most of our lifetime. But and Brexit, that's a whole different issue. I frankly have just said, let me know when that's over, and we can go from there. So next slide, please. And what I do just want to remind companies are, while we talk about USMCA and all of these issues, there still is a very aggressive enforcement agenda going on by the U.S. There's rarely a day goes by that we don't see a new anti-dumping or countervailing duty. These are traditional tariffs. Nobody's arguing with these. The U.S. is going through its steps. So all of this to say, for companies that are facing these challenges, you have to stay on top of trade and monitor this, because we are in a transformed global economy. And if you are a company that's importing or exporting from the United States and you haven't dusted off your customs compliance manual or have employees in their job descriptions that have customs as part of their job, it is really time to take a look at a customs compliance program, because we are seeing customs audits go through the roof right now. And part of that's the result is that we've been sharing so much information with government to get exclusions from tariffs and other things. The U.S. government right now knows more about what's happening in global supply chains than at any time in recent history. And that, by definition, audits will go up, which means you need to start looking at maybe doing some internal self-assessments and elsewhere. So moving to the next slide and really looking at where are we on USMCA in the remaining 15 minutes or so that we have. The good news here, I've showed this slide on these Globinars many times. The good news for us today is that we're actually in the blue part. We're finally at the finish line of where we're looking at. All of the procedural homework has been done, and we're basically right now waiting for Speaker Pelosi to introduce the implementing legislation for the USMCA. Next slide, please. And then once that starts, then we move into this process. So where have we been very quickly? We started about 2 years ago, this August. The deal with Mexico was last August. Actually, this past couple of weekends ago, I was at a family reunion that we have every year at the same weekend of September, and I thought, geez, what were we doing last year? And the reality was September 30th of 2018, we were waiting to see if we would have a full deal with Canada, and we got there. And so keep in mind, it's only been a year and change that we really had this deal in place. It was formally signed on November 30th of 2018. Next slide, please. And then we of course are where we are right now, where Mexico moved in. And so Mexico actually was required. If we look at where we are in each of the three countries, Mexico's done for all intents and purposes. Mexico was required by January 1st to implement domestic labor reform. That actually didn't take place until May of this year. And so much of the discussion that we'll have in just a few minutes has to do with that labor reform. The steel and aluminum tariffs were lifted on Mexico in May, right about the time the China deal fell through. So Mexico played its cards beautifully, because Mexico is retaliating against U.S. agricultural interests. So once the China deal fell through, Mexico said, White House, you need to do something to help your farmers. Why don't you lift the steel and aluminum tariffs on us? In return for that, we'll end our retaliation on U.S. ag, and we'll press forward with getting USMCA through our legislative processes, and that's exactly what happened. Mexico passed the USMCA through its Senate in June, and then published. Actually, Mexico is the first of the three countries that has published in its Gazette, or the equivalent of our Federal Register, the USMCA implementation. And part of the reason for that is Mexico was signaling, yes, we're done. Number two, signaling to the U.S. and Canada that we're done and we're not going to reopen this thing in total. So don't come with us with big changes. We've published it, we're done. And last but not least, Mexico was tiptoeing with recession-like numbers over the summer, and this was a way to calm investors that USMCA was secure. Now looking at Canada on the next slide, Canada went through the same process. Canada actually had some procedural hurdles to jump through, but once the steel and aluminum tariffs were lifted in May, it introduced the legislation into its House of Commons, and it was advancing, but one of the things that Canada had to deal with was it wanted to ensure the White House that it was maintaining fidelity to its agreement to pass the USMCA, at the same time not getting so far ahead of the Democrats in Congress who are like-minded in terms of a liberal government in Canada and Democrats in Congress, that they were not stepping on the Democrats' toes. And so Canada, I also think, played this rather beautifully and said, you know what, we're going to get this as far as we can, but we're not going to finish because we want to work in tandem with the U.S. And so the idea was, if the U.S. passed it this summer, Canada would have called back its parliament that was on summer recess, but that didn't happen. The issue now in Canada is that the election. We are in the middle of the Canadian elections federally, which are October 21st. This is actually debate week. There was a debate last night, English language, French language debate later this week. USMCA really has not been a huge election issue, but one of the things that's interesting procedurally is that Canada's election it will happen in October. The government likely won't come into play until 2020. So even if everything happened today, it's likely Canada would not pass the USMCA. So Canada would likely end up last if Congress is able to do this fall. Do it in 2020. Right now, there's no significant question, but the commentators are that Canada will likely be in a minority government situation, which could be interesting to see if some of the left-leaning parties, the Green, the New Democratic Party, if they are the key votes that are needed. The NDP has actually said they would want to reopen NAFTA. That may be a lot of politics right now. I think it could be bumpy in the early part of the year if we have a minority government, but I think it'll get passed in Canada just given the importance of the issue. But keep an eye on that. Canada's election is a factor in all of this, but I do think we'll get to yes. Now, of course, as we get to the finish line here, next slide, please. Where are we in the United States? Obviously, we lifted our steel and aluminum tariffs. Congress said they wouldn't do anything without steel and aluminum being lifted. We got our last procedural ITC report. So all of those dots I showed at the beginning, we're now in the blue area. So right now we're waiting for Speaker Pelosi to introduce the bill. It then goes into the House Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committee. And this is where so-called fast track comes into play. There's 45 each committee or each side of the House of Congress, Senate and House, and it has to start in the House, have 45 days. Debate is limited, and there can be no amendments. So basically, there's 90 days in which to get this done under fast track once it's introduced. And right now, the situation we're in is a little bit like when you're getting onto the interstate or the expressway or whatever you call it, wherever you're from, the Autobahn, et cetera, and you're trying to get onto that fast track, onto that ramp, but there's the car in front of you that is using every last inch of the merge lane. And all you want to do is get onto the fast track. You're the White House right now. They want to get this onto the fast track, get it into Congress, and go forward. But Speaker Pelosi is that car in front of you that's saying, nope, we are not merging over until we know it's safe. And so that's where there's a little bit of tension. And so while there are no amendments under fast track, the procedure that generally takes place is what's called a mock markup, where the White House will give a version of the bill to the House, say, mark it up, let us know where there are any changes, because once we know this is official, we can't really change too much. And so that's the process that we're in right now. It's not quite a markup. We're doing negotiations, but that's where we are. So next slide, please. So we're waiting for this bill. So what are some of the issues that are in play? This summer, we were saying we were about 40 to 80 votes short because this has to start in the U.S. House of Representatives with Democrat controlled. There are 197 Republicans. So just taking a step back, there's 435 House seats, 2 are vacant, so you got 433, and there's 1 independent. There are 235 Democrats, 197 Republicans. You need 218 votes for a majority. So let's assume that every Republican voted. Now, we don't think every Republican's going to vote, but you got about 190 Republicans. You would need about 30 Democrats to 40 Democrats to get there. So whenever you talk to the coalitions, the past USMCA folks, et cetera, they would say we need about 40 Democrat votes over the summer. That was to get to a basic majority. Our math was actually we needed about 60 to 80 votes just to get to that majority level, because there were some Republicans at the time that were holding out on issues like seasonality, et cetera. That was this summer. However, there had been constant rumblings that Speaker Pelosi wanted to see momentum. So she may need not 20, 30, 40 Democrats. She may be looking at 100 Democrats. And one example that we have is the border bill that passed at the end of June had a majority of Republicans, so that 180, 190 number, and about 130 Democrats. So in order for this to be a majority, it would need to maybe have 100 to 130 Democrats. But for the summer purposes, just to get to a majority, everybody was looking at somewhere between 40 to 80 votes. In order to get there, Speaker Pelosi created 4 working groups, one on labor, one on enforcement, one on pharmaceuticals, and one on the environment. And those were the major issues that the Democrats had. Labor was less about the substance of Mexico's labor reform. Mexico did a great job from May throughout the summer explaining to Democrats what was in their domestic labor reforms. Nobody's really arguing right now that Mexico's domestic labor reforms substantively are a challenge. The question is, will Mexico implement those reforms? In order to implement those labor reforms, Mexico has to review 600,000 existing collective bargaining agreements, deal with 1 million existing labor claims, and set up tribunals and all other types of issues, and all of that costs money. And so the issue for the Democrats, both in the summer and now, was would AMLO in Mexico give enough of the budget to actually implement these reforms? Enforcement was, how will we enforce this agreement? A lot of the talk that you hear from Speaker Pelosi about enforcement actually is labor. They just don't want to say that it's labor because that sounds like it's union and all of that. But the enforcement is, are you going to implement the labor reforms? And there are some issues regarding dispute resolution and some other issues. So labor and enforcement are kind of one of the same. Pharmaceuticals, and we talked about this back in June when we had a Globinar, is right now the most sophisticated types of pharmaceuticals that are out there are what are called biologics. These aren't chemical compounds, these are living organisms that are often, there's a lot of R&D around those that are used to treat cancer, Parkinson's, a number of other diseases. They're also, because they're living organisms, very expensive in which to do the research and development. So Big Pharma has always said once we develop these drugs, we need market exclusivity to be able to sell these drugs so that we can have the return on our investment. And this was a big issue during the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare debate. Many members of Congress, particularly Democrats, wanted that to be about 5 to 6 years market exclusivity. Pharma got 12 under U.S. law. Canada is 8 and Mexico was 5. When they negotiated this in the NAFTA, in the USMCA, USMCA has now been set at 10. So that is much higher than where Canada and certainly Mexico wanted to be. In fact, during the TPP, now CPTPP, this became a deal breaker because the U.S. got it to 8. That was already a little bit farther than Canada and Mexico wanted to go and other countries around the world. And frankly, Pharma said that that's not enough. It actually worked to tank the TPP. So you actually had Republicans voting no. So this is a big issue that's out there because the other side of the argument is, yes, Pharma, you may need the R&D, but that's going to delay generics entering the market and keep prescription drugs high. And when you consider that every Democrat that ran in 2018 ran on a prescription drug affordability, and many Republicans, that's a big issue out there. And lastly, environment was another issue. Some of these issues are very localized, wastewater treatment infrastructure in San Diego and Laredo and elsewhere. And there are now 100 Democrats calling for climate change to be introduced. And you can imagine if you have climate change put into a trade bill, you'll start losing those Republican votes. And so what Speaker Pelosi did was put two members of Congress, usually one from the kind of conservative side of the Democrats, the New Democrats, Blue Dog Democrats, as they're known, and one from the Progressive Caucus. And so the idea here was that if these groups could work it out amongst themselves, that whatever deal they would come up with would be palatable to most members of the Democrat caucus. So this was all happening over the summer. Everybody had said that that this was moving constructively. And that was always a signal to us this summer that there was no deal. Why? Because when people are saying there's something constructive, it means there's been no crying yet. And the only way that you're going to get a deal is that if each side shows that, you know, we've done everything we can, we've squeezed every last drop. So the more that you hear these are constructive and there's not a lot of crying, that lets you know that we're not at a deal. Because each side at the end has to be able to say, we're just not getting what we want, to show their various stakeholder communities. So as long as you hear that things are moving constructively, that's a sign that there's not a deal. The other issue this summer was that there were no concrete proposals really put forward. And so then we went to the August recess. So where are we now based on, there has been progress. If I can go to the next slide and we'll quickly wrap up here. We right now, today, I would say we have more than the majority of votes needed. If Speaker Pelosi brought the bill, we would get there. We have about 250 to 260 yay votes, which is about 180, 90 Republicans and about 80 Democrats right now. The issue is Speaker Pelosi, I think at this time, doesn't think 80 is enough. She's got to get to that 100 to 130 number. And the only way that you can get there, just before I get to some of the math, there was a counter proposal from USTR, so we did start seeing constructive ideas, and House working groups have now given back their counter, and everybody's still talking the constructive language. Where did we get to? The big issue right now is on enforcement. Actually, we've dealt with some things on state to state and panel blocking. So some of the technical trade issues have been worked out. One issue that's out there is binational inspection teams. Democrats want the ability that if there is a labor violation in Mexico, to be able to send that unions could raise that, or other parts of civil society, and those inspections, that there would be a binational inspection team from the other two countries that would go in, issue a report. That should be big news for companies. Because right now, if you're doing business in Mexico, or because that's going to be a reciprocal if it happens, that means if you're operating a farm in the United States where you employ Mexican migrants, that if somebody thinks that you're violating labor law, binational inspection teams may be coming your way and filing a report. That's something very important for folks, the business community, to pay attention to. On labor, this is the most important issue. Mexico released its budget in September, in early September. It didn't reflect, and I think this was a big miss for Mexico. Mexico did not put in there, here's what we're giving to labor reform. It didn't have it in a nice, easy to read box. In fact, it looks like Mexico had cut some of the funding by 35 to 40%. Right now, Ujczo from Mexico was in Washington last week. The Mexicans are coming back next week, and we have a congressional delegation down in Mexico right now saying, where is the money? Are you going to fund this? And so if there's any issue to watch right now, it's what does Chairman Neal say today or tomorrow when they come back from Mexico. Pharma, where pharma could have been problematic, it looks like we're actually reaching a deal there where we've agreed to a ratchet down proposal where if the U.S. Congress reduces our 12-year rule that I talked about earlier, and it goes below the 10 years in USMCA, that now becomes the USMCA rule. And it looks like environment has been resolved, less on climate change, but more like funding to the North American Development Bank and the Border Infrastructure Fund. So there are the makings of a deal here. The question is, will we get there? And the last couple of slides here. So next slide, please, and we'll wrap up and turn it over to David. If I can get to the next slide. Is, are we going to get there? Because what do you need to be watching for to get to 100 to 130 Democrats? Number one is we only have 20 legislative days left this year. And we have only passed 3 trade deals ever in an even numbered year in 2020 because electoral politics will take over. This is now or never time right now, or at least now or November 2020 time. Couple of issues. The UAW is still on strike. The Democrats will not bring this bill while there are UAW workers on the picket lines. They're just not. And the UAW, there are proposals going back and forth, but watch, number one, what happens with UAW. Will it wrap up this week? There is talk this could go as long as Christmas. That's going to be a problem. Secondly, as I said, watch what Chairman Neal says coming back today or tomorrow. And then watch if UAW and what Chairman Neal says, where's labor on this? Because the only way you're going to get the next 40 to 50 votes if labor blesses this. Then look at what Pharma says about the ratchet down proposal. So if Pharma all of a sudden starts saying, this isn't good enough for us, we may have to start counting Republican votes. USTR has also been called to the Hill on the digital chapter. We'll have to see more like that. And I tell you what, if we start seeing a lot more noise around climate change, that means the Democrats have no intention of bringing this bill. So right now, this all comes down to will labor address this deal? And I think labor doesn't have to bless it, but they can't burn it and allow Speaker Pelosi. Next slide, please. Now, there are other issues as we wind down here. There is a lot of talk that there will be a grand bargain. Speaker Pelosi knows she has something the White House wants. There has been talk of trading this for pension reform, which would bring labor on side, maybe gun reform, something on a prescription drug. And of course, we have a lot of appropriations bills going through Congress right now, or at least the Senate. Perhaps there'll be some kind of deal. The issue there is when that horse trading starts happening, the Potomac two-step, if you will, do we start losing Republican votes? So one of the things, and oh yeah, I've gone an entire half an hour without talking about the I word, which is impeachment. And will there be any oxygen in the room to do a deal? Some believe that impeachment leaves us to that there'll be absolutely no oxygen. Others say that the Democrats will want to show that they can walk and chew gum. The reality is, can they get it done in 20 days is really the issue. So where does that leave us? Last slide here. Next slide, please. And what are the scenarios that we're looking at? I think Speaker Pelosi will do a temperature check in October. So all the homework will get done over the next couple of weeks. And then she's going to say, is there momentum on impeachment? Does Mexico have done what it's done? And is it going to be trick or treat? If we go forward, it's going to move fast this year. If not, we won't see this until November of 2020 or 2021. And who's going to get blamed if they decide not to go? It's going to be Mexico. My view is that the Democrats will say, look, Mexico has not done enough on labor reform. This isn't about Trump. This isn't about impeachment. We want to see Mexico actually begin to do labor reform. We saw Representative Andy Levin from Michigan, right outside of Detroit just a few days ago, introduced a bill that says they will not move forward, or at least a proposal, that perhaps we won't move forward until we see the labor reform implemented in 500 Mexican facilities. So that's something, again, to just keep an eye on as we go forward. Next slide, please. So what are our options as we look? There was a lot of talk over the summer that this was all Botox. The Democrats just want cosmetic changes. That's not true. The deal that will emerge from this process will look different than the deal that was reached in November of 2018. Business has to pay attention to the changes that are coming because they all have implications. The grand bargain looks like there will be a bargain scenario. And then if Speaker Pelosi doesn't like the political winds at the end of October, we're getting into the blame and bump, where each side will blame each other, we'll blame Mexico, and we'll bump this into 2020 and raise some campaign dollars while we'll do it. Last slide, please. And I've gone way over time. Just blow it up. All I'll say on this is I don't see a scenario where President Trump blows up. He may try to withdraw from the existing NAFTA, but Congress or the courts will step in. Companies can rest assured throughout this year, if it does get kicked, that we'll either have NAFTA or the USMCA in place. I don't see a gap scenario. It may get bumpy. There may be a lot of noise, but just keep plugging away. And next slide, please. And I do just want to remind everybody that as things go forward in this, I'll just stop here. As things go forward, that no matter what happens, there will be uniform regulations that have to be designed. So it's very important for companies to dig in right now and see what's happening, pay attention, and continue to check in with the Global Chamber and elsewhere, because those regulations are going to impact what you do day in and day out. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to David.
Fantastic. Great summary. And it's reassuring that the blow up scenario doesn't look like it's going to be possible. Quite an optimistic, I think, relatively optimistic, maybe more optimistic than I had imagined. So David Farca, who is here next to me, is the president of the International Business Group. David is originally from Mexico, but he's now based in the United States. He is going to be providing a little bit more context around some of the on-the-ground activities here in the Western U.S. We talked about, Dan talked about produce, live produce, and also automotive and some of the other industries that are impacted in the Western U.S. between the U.S. and Mexico. David is right on top of all of that. So David, thank you for sharing today.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks for having me, and fantastic presentation, Dan. I think you brought my presentation down to 5 minutes only. But it's great to collaborate with you and be in the room with such an expert. So my task or my guideline was to talk a little bit about the Mexico perspective. What's going on in Mexico, how it's affecting or benefiting Mexico, and what's that point of view from a south of the border perspective. I'm going to take it up exactly where Dan left it, which is the possibility of withdrawing from NAFTA. And we've heard that in years past, even when USMCA was being negotiated, that one of the strategies from the executive branch would be to pull out of NAFTA and put some more pressure on Congress to strike an agreement or to come up with an agreement that would replace NAFTA. I am happy to hear that possibility is a little bit more remote, but I think that what's happening with this executive branch, you really never know. I personally believe that it's also a very remote possibility, but a possibility nonetheless. I think that what's going to happen in the next 2 months will tell us if that even gets back on the table or not. But being an endless optimist, I believe that with what's happening around the world and what's happening with other negotiations and trade disputes, it would be a bad move to withdraw from NAFTA just to put pressure on political pressure to get USMCA passed. Anyway, so about USMCA, as Dan mentioned, it's still pending approval in the US and Canada. Just wanted to go over main objectives achieved. As you see on this slide, international dispute resolution, the milk industry, which was basically had a lot more impact in Canada than it did in the US and Mexico. Obviously, a lot of changes in the automotive industry. It did have a clause in there for periodic revision after 16 years, not a sunset clause, but a revision to the agreement. And I think that's healthy. As Dan mentioned, we have the 27th anniversary of NAFTA, and I think it could have been revised a couple years before and incorporate a lot of other things that we didn't even know existed when it was originally signed. In the energy sector, even though there's not a lot of major reforms when it comes to clean energy, there is a lot in there when it comes to oil and gas. Intellectual property was something that was definitely agreed that it wasn't part of the original NAFTA, as well as digital exchange. So those were big parts of the new agreement. Next slide, please. When we're looking specifically at Mexico, I'm going to give you a small video that was put out by the Wilson Center, specifically the Mexico Institute within the Wilson Center. And this talks a little bit about the relationship between Mexico and the US when it comes to trade. Can we play that?
Does the slide have
Yeah.
Sorry that the video is not playing. I will try it at the end if
Okay,
that's
it's fine. I'll just talk a little bit about it. One of the interesting points is Mexico became the #1 trading partner with the US at the first half of this year. That is significant. Some people say that it's because of the tariffs that are being played with China, that allowed Mexico to take that #1 spot. Regardless of the reason, it makes it extremely interesting for trade that that's the fact today. So it's something that has to be in every discussion when it comes to the new USMCA, and obviously Canada being the second, and now China being the third. So it makes the North American region an extremely interesting region from a worldwide perspective. Next slide. So when it comes to Mexico, let's look at what NAFTA has done in Mexico. Under NAFTA, which is the last 27 years, exports increased in Mexico 6.8 times, almost 7 times during those 27 years. It made Mexico an industrialized country, a manufacturing hub. It really helped Mexico's economy. And we have to consider that USMCA, as well as NAFTA at the time, are not standalone agreements. They are weaved into the fabric of what the nation and the nations do together. What do I mean by that? When Mexico became a highly industrialized country, employment raised significantly, wages rose as well, and you see a decrease in immigration from Mexico to the US. There's a Pew Research report that in the last 5 years, Mexico has actually had negative immigration, meaning that more people have gone back to Mexico that have come to the US. And most of the immigration that you see today is from Central America that's lacking that vital economy, that manufacturing economy that NAFTA helped Mexico provide. So all these agreements are weaved with a lot of different aspects that affect our daily lives. As I mentioned, Mexico becomes the #1 trading partner with the US in April of this year, which is significant. Then we go to the status. I'm going to go over some of the points that Dan mentioned a little bit more in depth. The status of USMCA, or TMEC as it's called in Mexico, were overwhelmingly approved in Mexico's Congress on July 9th with 114 votes in favor, 4 votes again, and 3 abstentions, which means it not only was approved, but it was overwhelmingly approved. And one of the facts that often goes unnoticed, because it just gets mentioned that it did get approved, not only did it overwhelmingly get approved, but you have to keep in mind that Mexico went through a transition of power in June. Peña Nieto's party left office, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO's party, came into power, and you cannot talk about 2 further extremes. The new administration, it's a far left administration. The past administration was more towards the right. And here you have 2 polarizing factions from a political perspective that both agree overwhelmingly on the advantage of the USMCA for the country. And that's something that we would like to see a little bit more happening in the US, that you put politics aside, whether you're left or you're right. This is something that most people would agree that it's a benefit to the country. And you see that a little bit more specifically here in Arizona, where we are, where you have our congressional delegation, you have our 2 senators in both agreeing from 2 different parties, both agreeing and coming out publicly supporting USMCA. You have congressmen like David Farca, who's a Republican, or Congressman Stanton, that's a Democrat, both in favor of USMCA. So you see a little bit more cohesiveness between the congressional delegation in Arizona that you see in most other states. I wish there were more in the Arizona delegation that publicly came out for it, but that's the reality of where it is today. Also, a Mexican Senate approved the labor reform, again, with 210 votes in favor, 0 votes against. That also speaks to the fact that this Senate, it's a Senate that's a lot more to the left. Obviously, labor reforms, something that benefits the worker, is going to be on a front and center on a left agenda. So it had absolutely no issues getting approved. What does this mean? Some of the things that Dan was mentioning, first of all, is within this labor reform, it's the right to assemble and negotiate collectively. Basically, these are established in the International Labor Organization, and it mirrors whatever's in those guidelines. So that's the first and foremost law that was approved. Then the establishment of an independent institute to resolve disputes. And this is where Dan's comment about funding comes into play. The establishment of this independent institute has to be funded from somewhere, and that's where in the next year's budget that came out in September in Mexico, it's not as specifically clear on how it's funded. The formation of a labor court, same thing. That's up to the federal government to fund and to establish. And one thing that was well received, not only in the US and Canada, but in Mexico as well, is that it reduces individual disputes from 3 to 5 years that it takes today in Mexico to only 45 days. And even Mexican businesses that do not export welcome these type of laws. Labor law in Mexico was pretty archaic. It did need this reform, and the fact that you can settle a labor dispute in 45 days rather than in 3 to 5 years, it's huge, and it's an impact that it's already taking place in Mexico. Can we go to the next slide, please? The 4 main effects that this has had in Mexico, I would say, these are not the only effects, I would start by saying, but these are the major ones. And we start with the automotive industry. In the automotive industry, in the new USMCA, it brought the components of a car made in any of the 3 countries from 62.5% to 75% of those parts that have to come from any of those 3 countries. So a lot of what this was trying to achieve was closing that back door to China, which is what Dan was talking about. It's a reality that a lot of those parts came from either China or came from Korea. Even in manufacturing plants in Mexico, those parts came from Asia. So now with this new agreement, those parts have to be bought from any of those 3 North American countries. It's really uncertain to know if this affects more of a Mexican manufacturer or an American manufacturer. A lot of American brands manufacturing in Mexico were bringing their own parts from Asia as well. So this really affects the entire industry. And then the other aspect in the automotive industry is that a minimum of 40% of the workers that manufacture those cars have to have a minimum wage of $16 an hour. This also speaks a little bit to Dan's comment that if you're going to play, you have to play fairly in all 3 countries. So this was one of those things that raised the average wages, especially in Mexico, for the workers in the automotive industry. Now, again, this is still to be determined how much of an effect it takes within the industry. A lot of the manufacturing plants in the automotive industry that I've personally visited in the last year or 2, the majority of them are highly automated. So the labor that goes into that manufacturing has been reduced significantly, I would say in the last decade. So I don't know exactly how much that will affect. And a lot of the skill that's needed now for manufacturing the automotive industry is a highly skilled labor rather than low income wages. So I think that will not impact significantly on the price of a finished product, but that's something that needed to be in there to make a more fair playing field for everybody. Then another impact specifically in Mexico is in the pharmaceuticals with the increased barriers for generic prescriptions. And that's the 5, 8, and 10 years that Dan was talking about. It's definitely something to watch in the pharmaceutical industry in Mexico, as right now they can come up with generics within a 5-year period of time. Labor rights, we already talked about. That's already passed. We went into detail on that specifically, and I think that's going to help Mexico throughout, because if there's a particular industry that's paying more than other industries, the workers will tend to go to their industry, thus raising the labors in other industry as well. Mexico will not be a country that you would go just to manufacture for cheap labor. It hasn't been in the last decade at least, and you see that a lot of the industries like the fashion industry, what we call the fast fashion industry, those are mostly in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, but no longer in Mexico, because Mexico is not, today it's not a cheap labor country as it was probably when NAFTA got established 27 years ago. And then we have e-commerce. There's a lot of different parameters within e-commerce, but one of the big things that specifically will benefit Mexican consumers, and that's the elimination of duties for online purchases. Any item that's bought in Canada up to 150 Canadian dollars will not incur duties if purchased from Mexico, and $100 of any product purchased from the US. This becomes a great advantage for projects like Skybridge here in Arizona that are targeting that e-commerce flow of goods through joint inspection of Mexican customs and US customs in one facility, and being able to ship those products directly to the consumer rather than to warehousing in other aspects in Mexico. So this is something that really benefits the Mexican consumer and the American and Canadian e-commerce companies. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do you get involved? We talked about the fact that mostly we're waiting for Canada and the US to approve the agreements. There's a lot of politics going on, but as always in the US, one of the things that I loved when I moved here is that your voice actually gets heard. So if you want to get more information, the Arizona-Mexico Commission here in Arizona has a fantastic website, usmcanow.org. You can find fact sheets. You can find on who your representative is, what the impact of this specifically in Arizona is, or any other state for that purpose. You can add your name to a support list to USMCA, or one of the most important aspects that I see is writing to your representative. If you haven't heard your representative come out in public in favor of USMCA, there's on this website, there's even sample letters that you can just copy and paste and send to your representative in support of USMCA. Any constituent letter that goes to a congressperson gets heard. The more they get, the more they know that it's going to help them in their future elections as well with their constituents, and the more they'll push it forward. So I want to leave you with that thought. If you have any further questions or would like more information about specifically how it affects Mexico, my information is on the last sheet. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I share your optimism. I was in a presentation with a bunch of Europeans a few days ago, and I was that positive, and I was kind of shot down, like, you know, oh no, the world is coming to an end. But I'm like you, where from Dan's information and your information in terms of those of you who are running businesses, you have ways of staying in touch, you have ways of providing your input, and it seems to be actually happening in this area. Relative to 10 years ago, politicians couldn't spell trade, but now they all seem to be kind of moving, at least in the US and in Mexico and even in Canada, moving in the same direction no matter which party. So that's very good. So you as a viewer, please hopefully you wrote down the information from David. Stay in touch with Dan as well. Dan has a client newsletter that if you're interested in receiving that, please send an email to info@globalchamber.org and we'll be able to get that over to you, or contact Dan or Dave directly. If you can't do that, send information to us and we'll get them to them. We don't have very much time. It looks only just like a few minutes. So the first question, you know, which, you know, I'm not sure you're going to want to answer this one, but basically the question is, you know, given kind of where things are, what's the probability of NAFTA being done in 2019? So what's the hard number? Do you guys want to make a prediction? Dan, do you want to? Are you a gamer? You want to put a percentage on it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to put a percentage, but I think that if labor, if the UAW strike walks out, if Congress feels okay coming back from Mexico, then there certainly is a lane to getting it done this year. And once that happens, once Speaker Pelosi introduces the bill, there are the votes. More and more Democrats will come on side. There may be some noise, but I think they could likely get it done by the end of the year. My largest concern is just timing, is that we're going to run out of time. And I think if it's not done by the end of the year, because UAW is still on the picket line, if you start seeing that Chairman Neal comes back and says things aren't like we think they should be in Mexico, and then impeachment just starts sucking the oxygen out of the room, then this will not be done in 2020. It'll be punted to the lame duck of November 2020, where we're often, which is where we actually do a lot of our trade deals, is in the lame duck, or we'll kick to the next Congress. But so it really is a now or November 2020 time, in my opinion.
Okay, and I'll come back to you, David, in a second. But the second question of the ones we have are, Dan, kind of building off of that. It's a reconfirmation that understanding the process. So there's 20 legislative days to enter the highway, you know, for Pelosi to introduce the implementing bill. If Pelosi introduces the legislation before year end, then ratification process takes place safely early next year in U.S. Congress, despite U.S. elections. I think you just said that, but just to reconfirm it.
Yeah, if she introduces the bill, it passes. It may be done. You know, we did the last 3 trade deals in 3 days last time. They passed. So we can move rather quickly once that bill's introduced, if she feels, because she's not going to introduce it unless she feels there's the vote. So it could maybe slip into early in the new year, as long as they get it done before the Iowa caucuses. But I think the question is, will she or will she not introduce that bill? And she's not going to do it unless she knows she's got the vote. There's nobody that's a better vote counter than Speaker Pelosi. Whatever your politics, she knows how to count votes. And she's not going to bring it unless she thinks she's got it. And so I think that's what we're waiting for. But the only way she gets to that big number of Democrat votes is if Labor at least releases its legislators to go forward. They don't have to say we agree with it. They just can't burn it. They don't have to bless it. They can't burn it either.
Okay, and it sounds like one of the potential is that they would then come back on the labor side and demand more from Mexico, is what I thought you said. And so is that fair to say? That's one of the possibilities?
Yeah, I think if the Democrats need a way to not move forward, they're not going to say it, because right now they're worried about being blamed for being obstructionists, those kind of things. What they can say is, look, we want to support this. Mexico just hasn't done enough. yet. We want to see those budget. We want to see implementation. I'm a little bit concerned with some of that noise coming from the progressive side of the Democrats that are saying we actually want to see it implemented in 500 facilities. You know, that's going to take time to do. And it's time we don't have right now.
David, you got a percentage in your head? Of
well, I would like to play it safe and say 50-50. But I think that if, as Dan mentions, they want to see implementation of those labor laws in Mexico, it's definitely not going to get it be done. There's just not enough time for that. I think it's that if that comes up, I see it more as an excuse than an actual need for it. I think overwhelmingly you've seen the votes that have taken in both Senate and Congress, not only to pass USMCA, but to approve the labor laws, and those have been loud and clear that everybody is on that page. When it comes to Mexico politics, you've got to keep in mind that this government came in with an austerity point of view, saving money and cutting everywhere. So from an internal politics point of view in Mexico, it's hard to say that you're going to dedicate a big part of your budget to implementing these labor laws to appease a neighboring country more than going through the social agenda that they want to pull through. So I think that's why they were very broad in their budget, not because they don't want to do it, but because they don't want to bring it to light that this is going to be a big expense on the budget compared to what they're spending inside of Mexico. So I think that that's the only thing that Mexico will have to be very careful about, and that's an internal politic. But I think that they have the intention to allot those budgets, and they have the intention of putting all this to practice, because, as we say, these are more social reforms when it comes to labor that Mexico needs. It's just the way that's presented internally.
Okay, very good. So we come to the end of our hour, so I'll give you each 30 seconds, if you will, a minute to just anything else you'd like to comment on, anything else that wasn't covered, or any other summary points. David, would you like to start?
No, I think it was mostly covered. My only point it would be get involved however you want, get your name on a list of support, write to your congressperson. Don't sit on the sidelines and wait, get involved in the process.
Okay. Very good. Dan, you are involved in the process. Thank you for your work. Would you like to wrap us up?
I would just agree with that 100%. I think one point that we emphasize to all of our clients is we have to get out of denial that things are changing. Whether it's USMCA, China, et cetera, we are in a transformed global economy. It will be that way when the dust settles. And as a company, you need to get ahead of that right now. I mean, there's just this idea that the world's going to go back to the way it was before 2016 or at least 2017. And, you know, this is just an aberration, is a myth. It's fantasy. It's wishful thinking. The idea is we are changed and we have to move forward and deal with the world as it is, not the way we want it to be right now.
Great. Good words of wisdom. Thank you both, gentlemen. Really appreciate it. Contact us to get a hold of both of these experts. Our next steps are, we've got Globinars constantly coming at you. We have one on Japan, doing business there. We have one on leadership, global leadership. We have one on the virtual League of Extraordinaries. If you're a service provider, ask us more about that. That's a fun event that we do every month. So those are some of the things that are coming up in the next couple weeks. Thank you for joining in wherever you are. Stay engaged, and thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.